Welcome to Being Human. I'm delighted to say that this week's guest is Dr. Peter Levine. He's an author, on my count, of at least 10 books on trauma and trauma recovery. He's the founder of the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute. Dr. Levine, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
It's a pleasure. So I've got twin motivations for having you as a guest. I personally have done a lot of work on my own birth trauma over the last 10 years, a lot of which has included a lot of body work. And so I'm very interested in your perspective on trauma recovery personally, but also as a business coach. I see a lot of unresolved trauma playing out in the workplace. This is a topic we don't talk about a lot in the workplace. And I know that you've mentioned it in some of your books. Even in the first book, you talk about this problem of reenactment and how that plays out, especially in the workplace. So all of that is, I think, going to be very interesting to a business audience. I'm so glad to be able to have this conversation.
Yeah. No, I think trauma is one of these. There's a fish know it's in water. So trauma I could be like a major trauma, or just an accumulation of smaller traumas or stresses over time that leads to a breakdown in our functioning. And like you say, that the reenactments come up much more than people realize in different, even in work situations. Some characteristic of one person triggers something in another. And all of a sudden, instead of working cooperatively, they're antagonistic to each other because they're experiencing each other as threat because of the unresolved trauma, the hidden reenactment. In a way, you can say we choose our not just business partners, but our intimate partners also to fill a role, to have a part in our reenactment, and usually vice versa for the other person as well. In other words, we're attracted to each other in many ways, not entirely, of course, but to a significant degree because of the different trauma that we've had in our own lifetimes.
So maybe let's unpack that a little bit as probably a great place to start. So what exactly do we mean by reenactment, and why do we feel compelled to reenact?
Yeah. This is something that I first examined in my first book, Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma. And it just is, there isn't like a simple reason why this happens. Freud believed that we reenact our traumas in order to heal them, essentially. And I suppose you can look at it that way in some instances, but I think it's much deeper than that. It's almost like we have in our nervous system a magnet. And this magnet is tuned in a way to a certain frequency. And then you have somebody else and it could be somebody else without their own trauma, but very often, again, it's somebody also has their trauma and has their magnet. And these magnets, sometimes they're called strange attractors in chaos theory. And they just seek each other, the way the electrons seek protons or something, and they're just driven to each other. And it is, of course, with consciousness, with awareness, it is possible to use our behavioral reenactments, our emotional reenactments, as a way of getting into, of accessing our unresolved trauma. And so when we, all of a sudden, we're really getting, oh my gosh, why am I so upset about this person, or angry about this person, or fearful about this person? There's something about them. And it could be something like a posture, a gesture. Of course, it could be something like the smell of smoke or alcohol. These are all things that can trigger a reaction that's inside of us, that's ready to be triggered, in a sense that's waiting to be triggered.
Yeah, and I could relate in my own experience, my own personal life. I went through a long phase in my 20s and 30s of being very attracted to women who were unavailable, which is kind of a classic pattern.
Sure.
But I think in a large part due to my own birth trauma, felt a separation from my mother. And then I think my version of reenactment in that case was continuing to seek women who I couldn't bond with. I found difficulty bonding with. And
right. Yeah, exactly. Like you say, that's a very, very common thing. And in a way, sometimes we'll pick a partner who is not available to reduce the likelihood of, let's see, how do I want to say this? The risk of becoming attached. Because when we try to attach, as you're describing in your earliest formative experiences around birth and after the birth, that you were unable to really get a solid attachment with your mother, then we don't want that pain again. Because for a small child, for an infant, for a baby, I mean, something like that is utterly overwhelming. And so because we also carry that baby part inside of us, we, in a way to protect that part, will seek somebody who's not available so that we can't really attach. If we can't really attach, then we can't really lose the attachment. So it's kind of involuted. It has its own logic, its own illogical logic. And we do set up that scenario over and over again. And again, this thing is, okay, how do we get out of something like that? And, my main interest is in what goes on in the body when people are traumatized. When we're frightened, threatened, or perceive that we're threatened, our bodies stiffen, they tighten, they contract. They also, if this is extreme stress, or if we experience a mortal threat, then our body just also collapses into what's called an immobility state, where we're numb, we're not feeling anything. We can go through the movements of life, but we're really not engaged in life. And I talked a lot about that in one of my other main books, which was In an Unspoken Voice. And so the key here in getting out of this situation is through awareness, and through awareness of the body sensations. Because when we're triggered, our body is going to be doing some very specific things. It's going to brace, it's going to retract, it's going to stiffen, it's going to collapse. And if we could become aware of those internal sensations, that's the key, internal sensations, then we can have enough distance to it and what I call renegotiate it. So, and one of the important things when our bodies respond, when our bodies are primed for trauma, one of the things that we need to be able to do is to find new experiences in our bodies that basically contradict those of fear, terror, rage, overwhelming helplessness. So I don't believe in it. It's helpful to relive traumas, but it's useful, what I call, to just visit or just touch in certain trauma so that we can begin to change the experience in our bodies. And that really is the key there.
And I think that's one of the distinctions of your work in terms of what I've read and experienced through therapy is that this focus on the body sensations. So it's not just about constructing a new narrative or feeling the feelings you couldn't feel. It's also about engaging at the physical level and having the sensations that you couldn't have and expressing in the body what you couldn't express at the time. Is it something like that?
No, absolutely. The idea is not to relive the trauma, because that doesn't really help. And to the nervous system, reliving it isn't any different than the original event. So you also risk the re-traumatization. But there's just really no logic to why you would want people to relive trauma. But again, they do need to notice what their responses are to the reminders of the trauma, if you like.
So is it like reliving a little bit of it, or is it something different?
Yeah, I instead of reliving, let me get my pencil here. Instead of reliving, I call it revisiting, and then looking for new experiences. It's an interesting area of research, which I talk about in another one of my books, Trauma and Memory, Brain, Body, and the Search for the
Which I just finished reading, actually, yeah.
Oh, you did? Okay, all right, great. Well, then you're aware of this. What was I talking about? Remind me.
Revisiting versus reliving.
Reliving, yeah. Revisiting. So revisiting is where we really, again, are just touching into what are called procedural memories, or the body memories about the trauma, because that's really what drives the whole process of reenactment and other symptoms, of course. So it's really becoming aware of what our body is wanting to do. Usually that's something that our body was unable to do many, many years ago, sometimes decades ago. Let's see, I can give you a small example of this. This is what really brought me to my understanding of trauma. And this is an event that happened, I think it was 1969. And I was asked to see this woman. She was in her 24, I think. And she had been suffering from all kinds of physical symptoms: chronic fatigue, irritable bowel, migraines, severe PMS, urinary problem. And she'd been sent to doctor. And finally, she was sent to a psychiatrist because she also had severe panic attacks and agoraphobia. She could barely leave her house, even with her husband. So the psychiatrist tried a couple of medications, and that didn't really help. So I had been developing some relaxation exercises in the 1960s, some body, mind, body exercises. And they seemed to be quite powerful. I'd worked with a number of people who had high blood pressure, and usually within 20 minutes, their blood pressure would drop to a normal or near normal level, even if it was 20, 30 degrees more. So he thought that maybe some of those relaxation procedures would be helpful for her. And I could see when she came into the consulting room, I could see her heart was beating at about 110, 120 beats a minute. Obvious, and her eyes were like deer in the headlight. Grabbed onto my eyes, and that was the first indication of what was really going on. So anyhow, I had her do some of these relaxation exercises in the jaw and the neck, shoulders, and her heart rate started coming down, and I was quite relieved. And it went down, but it went to like from 120 to 110 to 100 to 90 to 80 to 70 to 60 to 50 to, and she turned pale white. And that opened her eyes and looked at me just again with deer in the headlights eyes and said, I'm dying. Don't let me die. Help me, doctor. Don't let me die. I'm dying. And so at that moment, I had an image of a tiger crouched at the far end of the consulting room. And without quite knowing why, then at the time, I commanded her. I said, Nancy, there's a tiger chasing you. Run, climb these rocks, and escape. I discovered later, of course, where this came from. But after a while, her body started to her hands would become very cold. She would shake and tremble, perspire. Then her hands would start getting warmer. There'd be a deep, spontaneous breath. And these cycles went on for 30, 40 minutes. And at the end, she opened her eyes and she looked at me, not grabbing onto me with her eyes this time, but just reaching for contact. And she said, "Do you want to know what happened?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "Well, when you mentioned the tiger, I could see the tiger. We possibly were seeing the same tiger. And then when you said he's chasing me and run to escape, my legs felt like lead, like I was trying to walk through mud. But when you continued to encourage me, I could then feel power coming into my legs. And I climbed these rocks and looked down. And instead of seeing the tiger, I saw myself at the age of 4 having a routine tonsillectomy with ether, and the ether mask was forced onto me while I was being held down by doctors and the nurses. And so her body had wanted to run and escape from being on that operating table for 20 years. And then when she finally had the opportunity to renegotiate that, and then she was able to describe what she was feeling now, which was being held in warm, tingling waves. And I thought, well, where does that come from? And I, again, remember, in 1969, there was really nothing written about trauma. I mean, there was, shell shock from World War I, but, it wasn't considered to be something that widely that people had had experienced. So, and again, these can be routine experiences. They can be, of course, coming from households where, by the way, of course, the reason that I saw the tiger was I was actually in a seminar, and in the seminar, one of the professors talked about this phenomenon. When animals are restrained, they go into an immobility state, and that's where Nancy was. She was in a chronic immobility state, and that's what her panic attacks were about. But the thing is, in animals, this is meant to be time limited, normally time limited. So the animal goes into the immobility and comes out. But if the animal is frightened when it goes into the immobility, or frightened as it starts to come out of the immobility, it can stay there almost indefinitely. So this is, again, not consciously understanding it, but this image of the tiger popping out and sharing that vision in a way with her allowed her to come out of her immobility state. And again, that was the reason why I gave that first book the title, Waking the Tiger, because that's exactly what had happened. We had awakened the tiger, and the escape from the tiger, and the escape that her body had wanted to do for two decades.
And somehow you had an intuition that might be what she needed to visualize.
That's right. It was an intuition, and the intuition played out in that image. And the image was informed by this particular graduate seminar that I was taking at Berkeley. So, and I think that's one of the times that I really understood how important intuition is. And again, when you're traumatized, that interferes with our capacity for intuition. So we're not able to really judge a person, when we first meet them. If we have a trigger, we're not going to be able to do that. But if we're present in ourselves and not triggered, then we will get a good intuition. Is this a person that I want to spend time with? Is this a person that I can work with? All of these things come, they're visceral senses. People talk about gut instincts. Well, that's exactly where they are. They come from the gut. And again, in trauma, that information flow gets tremendously disrupted.
Right. And I think that when I look at my pattern of following my intuition, it was towards, I suppose the way that I've worked has probably been a little bit more, in terms of your perspective, maybe a bit too far on the reliving end versus the revisiting end. But nonetheless, I think I've made big progress. But it was definitely that intuition that I started to recover when I stopped drinking, because one of the ways I'd anesthetized myself was with heavy drinking. Self-medication. And I sort of, with some support, stopped that. And I started to, I think, regain some intuition. And then it was my intuition that had me reconnect with, I suppose, to some level, my body, actually. It started with my body. And then I read some of the books of Art Janov, which I'm guessing you've probably got some opinions on. But finding that mode of working on myself was actually what helped me recover. And it was all intuition driven, despite the fact that anything I read online about any of this work was very critical. And I just trusted my intuition in spite of a lot of the opinions I was reading about that type of work.
Right.
And a lot of people around. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. I was going to say also something about intuition is, for me, intuition is the interface between mind, knowledge, and being. And it requires both. It requires both. I mean, I think about younger, when he attacked Afghanistan and Iraq, he said, "These are my gut instincts to do this." Well, he didn't have any background knowledge. He really didn't. Or he would have known about the history of the region. He would have known to do things differently. But so that can be a problem when a person believes they're connected to their gut, but the gut is still sending information as though the trauma was existing. So we're not getting new information. We're in a way where it's become delusional.
It's almost like the gut is directing us towards a reenactment rather than what's most
instead of towards intuition. That's well said.
Yeah. And the other, I suppose, even now, right? I'll still, and you pick up on this in your last book. One of the key pushbacks for me when I talk about the fact that I relive or revisit a lot of my early trauma as a way to recover from it is, but you should leave the past in the past. And how can you remember all of that stuff? And really, you should be moving on. And I think that mindset is still enormously prevalent in society. And you, I think, very eloquently talk about memory in your book and how there is validity in accessing these former experiences. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
I just breathed in my teeth. Yeah. I didn't hear the last part of the question.
Let's talk about memory a little bit, and implicit, explicit memory, and why there is value in revisiting these old experiences.
Okay, there are basically two types of memory, and these are memories that are explicit and those that are implicit. Explicit memories, for example, declarative memory. In other words, I remember that I have an interview with a person on Zoom at 10 o'clock in the morning. And so I know, at 9:30, I turn my computer on and so forth. If I go into the market, I may have a list in my mind of items that I need. So these are the laundry lists, the shopping lists of the memory world. They're conscious, they're discrete. And that's what, when people think about memory, even many therapists, that's the kind of memory that they're believing is what memory is. But that's just one small type of memory. And in terms of the power it has over us, that has the smallest effect. Then there's another form of explicit memory, which is called autobiographical memory. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Then we have the implicit memories. And these are not conscious. They happen to us rather than us deliberately calling them up. And there are two types there. There's emotional memory, and then there's also what are called procedural memories, or sometimes called body memories. And so if we're talking about a trigger, all of a sudden we go into an emotional state. Well, that's an implicit memory. It's an emotional memory. We're actually emotionally remembering what happened. And then even deeper than the emotional memories are what are called procedural memories. And these are things that the body does, that the body learns. You know the expression, once you've learned to ride a bike, you'll never forget. And also when we're first learning to ride a bicycle, maybe with the guidance of a parent or an older sibling who's at our side, and then they let go, and then we're riding. So we have to learn very quickly what the body needs to do. And it's not a conscious thing. You know, you can't learn how to ski from a book. You have to have somebody there to help guide what your body is doing. And again, the learning, as an example with a bike, is almost one trial. And then once a memory gets fixed, it stays fixed. But what if that procedural memory, that body memory, is one of fight or flight, is one of twisting, of one of constricting, of one of collapsing? Then that's the memory that has to be accessed, and it has to be changed. It has to go to completion, as it did with Nancy. Let's see. Now, we need to, as I mentioned before, not just feel the emotional. That's important. There's no question about that. But what's underlying the emotion? And always, almost always, that's something that the body is, where the body is reacting. And that evokes the emotion. So we need not just to experience the emotion, but to experience what's underneath the emotion. There's a very interesting area of active research right now. It's called reconsolidation theory.
Right.
And basically, the idea here is that when you and I go over this in detail in the book, but the basic idea is that when a memory goes from short-term to longer-term memory, so we have a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is very good at short-term memory, but then it needs to bring it into long-term memory, which involves different parts of the brain. And certain proteins allow this to happen. So it changes the synaptic connectivity, it changes the structure of the dendrites, and that's how a memory becomes solidified. However, and this is the interesting part, if you have a memory, like a fear memory, and that memory is coming up and you interfere with the protein synthesis, so like proteins that we were talking before, then that memory essentially becomes erased. Now, and again, this is something that's been demonstrated with mice, with rats. And so when I talk about revisiting a trauma, it's touching in the trauma enough to bring up those circuits so that new responses can happen. And those will then be the new memories because they'll be reconsolidated as a successful escape as it was for Nancy. Of course, different things for different people. And now that becomes the memory. So it's not that we erase the memory. We actually, in a way, replace the memory through these molecular mechanisms.
Right, and I think that's what's so important for people to understand is that these memories aren't fixed. We reconstruct it anew in the present every time. And the second point is that these memories lie kind of dormant in the body. Well, dormant at least from a conscious perspective. They're active, but they lie beneath our consciousness for in perpetuity. Right? I mean, I'm still accessing your body memory, quote, from my birth now in my 40s.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the thing here is it's fine to access it. We just don't want to get stuck in it. You know, that's why I say I don't believe in memory erasure, because we will always have some access to those memories. But each time we have the opportunity to get a new reconsolidated memory. And, you know, people say, well, how long will it take me to get over my trauma? Well, it's not a question you can really honestly answer, because when we've had a lot of trauma, we'll keep coming to it, but we don't have to be bumping into it. We don't have to get caught on it like the sharp edge of a bookcase, something like that. We just in it, we hurt ourselves. But if it's a softer contour, then we just kind of brush against it and move through. And each time we do that, we, you know, people are used to say, we put the memory to rest in the past where it belongs. Well, that's only one part of it. The important part is that we actually, in the present, are creating new bodily experiences that, in a way, not only contradict those of fear, of terror, of helplessness. They not only do that, but we actually have a new memory of what happened. So it's not like we put the memory in the past, but we're taking the past memory, bringing it into the present, then reconsolidating it, having new emotional and physical experiences, and then we move on, because trauma, in a way, is a disorder of not being able to be, not to have the capacity to be in the here and now. That's really what trauma is. It's a disorder in presence.
Right. Yeah. Because this continual reenactment blocks us from being.
Exactly. It doesn't allow us. That's right. It doesn't allow us to be to really be in the present, to be fully in the present, to be in the here and now.
And what you've just said there reminds me of that quote from John Bradshaw. It talks about, he said, it's never too late to have a happy childhood.
Yes.
Right. That sounds strange. It may sound strange to people, but that's this idea. We can reconstruct it, but not in a false way, right? This is in a connected way.
That's right. Yeah.
Authentic.
Yeah, exactly. Because you actually have created those new experiences. Now, you need some help in guiding the client in this way, of course, you know, and allying with the inner child, you know, because we've learned to dissociate because of these continued pain and strife in our lives. We've learned to be able to do that. So again, in doing therapeutic work, it's bringing those parts of experience that have been disconnected from each other back together, so we experience ourselves as a coherent whole.
Right. And I think as we talk here, we talk a lot, and one of the ways that people sort of think about working on trauma, if they think about it at all, is they think about the individual and maybe the therapist. But you talk a lot about Indigenous people and practices and how historically communities have dealt with trauma, and it's much less about the individual. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. You know, when I started to teach at the Hopi Guidance Center in Arizona, in northern Arizona, usually I teach in my training by explaining theory, doing a demonstration, and having people practice. And so when I asked for a volunteer, nobody came up. And so I continued, but I was realizing that I needed some information that I didn't have. So at the time, there was an anthropologist visiting. And so I asked him to talk about his observations. And basically, his primary observation is that Hopis do not see themselves as individual people. They see themselves in terms of family, village, tribe. So when I reframed my question and my request, I said, does somebody want to present a case? And the people who worked there were extremely astute. You know, they had, some of them had graduate degrees, one with a PhD, or was going for a PhD. And so I asked them if they wanted to kind of present a case of somebody they were working with. And so they did. This is a client who, as a girl, was sexually abused. Then as an adolescent, she fell into a river and almost drowned. And I said, well, is there anybody here who's had an experience similar to hers? And then somebody immediately said, I do. I said, well, would you be willing to do some work with me right now so that you have more of an understanding and more of the tools in working with this client? And then there was no problem. People were glad to volunteer and to learn that way. But I had to understand that they don't see themselves as an individual working on themselves, but only as something that affects the whole community. And I think that's the part that we are sadly missing in our modern, Western cultures, is that we over rely on the individual. I mean, and there's been valuable things. It has a big plus side in that, we have competition, we invent, we, do things like that. We hopefully collaborate. But again, most of it is about the individual. It's about the Bill Gates or the Steve Jobs or the Elon Musk or whatever. But because of that, we alienate ourselves from others and also miss the potential for even richer collaboration. And I think bringing it back to maybe some of your interests in the workplace, you really want people who are not triggering each other or who know how to handle it if they're triggering each other. And you want to be able to help them move out of their trauma, because when you're in trauma, you're not going to be cooperative. It's going to be me against the world. So if you then can attenuate that and soften that and maybe even do some individual work with the people, then when you come out of the trauma nervous system, which is the sympathetic fight or flight, or what's also called the immobility collapse response with the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve involved. When that happens, then the nervous system has its third function, which Stephen Porges, a very dear friend and colleague, calls the social engagement system. And the social engagement system should be the default setting of our nervous system. So when we're not in fight or flight or experiencing mortal threat, our instincts are for social communication. I mean, go to any restaurant and just watch it. You don't have to even be listening. You're just looking at people with each other, contacting each other, speaking with each other, working out problems from their work. That is a very deep instinct to connect with others and to collaborate. And it's probably what gave us the edge, evolutionary edge, because we were able to share information with each other and to communicate that. So when the first person who made an arrowhead by accidentally, striking a flint to, start a fire, and then all of a sudden they realized this was a sharp thing and then could be, tied to a stick, or even fire itself, and to be able to communicate that. And then in a short period of time, that everybody, everywhere in the world, as it were, even without the internet, was making fires or making, weapons. So collaboration is a tremendously important part of the mammalian nervous system function. So
right, and I think in the workplace, it's like we have allowable topics for collaboration or allowable spheres of collaboration, but one that seems to be off limits is helping people heal from their past. That's and I can kind of get that, right? I mean, we could, businesses aren't necessarily there to help people heal, but I do think it could be a space within the context of business where questions like, what from your past do you think may have contributed to you reacting in that way? Let's say.
Right. And you need somebody to facilitate that, who knows what they're doing. Because again, you're not wanting to, well, in any case, you're not wanting to have them relive the traumas, but to just notice how they're triggered, and then to be able to create new experiences in themselves that allows them and the other person to be in the here and now and to work together and through social engagement system and to collaborate. Because I think that's the real power, and it always has been the real power of the human being. I liked the title of your organization or your webinar, Being Human. I mean, that's what we're looking for. And, it's another thing. There's a museum in Phoenix, Arizona, a musical instrument museum. It's a wonderful museum. It's one of the best museums I've ever been to, really, anywhere in the world. And very few people know about it. But anyhow, when you walk in, there's a sign that says, music is the language which connects everyone in the world, something like that. And I agree with that. But also trauma and trauma healing is also what connects everybody in the world.
Yeah.
Because we all share some degree of traumatization. Nobody gets through life without that. I've said that trauma is a fact of life, but it doesn't have to be a life sentence. And again, we can see these opportunities. If we feel safe enough with another person and with a facilitator, then they can begin to discover what's being triggered and to be able to do something, to be able to change that. And then with the goal, if you like, of coming back into the here and now towards a social engagement, towards collaboration, rather than, because very often, I say in the state for sure, even in the office place, it's about competition. Who's going to get to the next position and so forth. And of course, I mean, that's natural, I guess. But it becomes self-defeating after a certain amount of time. So you want, I guess, what you might call healthy competition, but competition which is primarily based on collaboration and cooperation. So I think that's the opportunity for people in business and any situation. I mean, teachers who have kids, you have a lot of kids in the school are highly traumatized, highly traumatized.
I mean, I don't know if this stat still stands, but I think in Waking the Tower, you said 25% of males, 33% of females sexually experience sexual trauma. I don't know if that's still holds.
Yeah, and that was back in the mid 90s, the early 90s. And it's much more than that. I think we know now. But yeah, I guess I was a little bit ahead of my time in seeing how pervasive this is. There's a questionnaire. It's called ACES, ACES, ACE, and it's adverse childhood experiences. The ACE, and there are 9 questions, I think, and you just yes, no, yes, no. So if you have more than 3 of these, you're very likely to have all kinds of, quote, psychological problems. But not only psychological problems, if you have these higher levels of these experiences in your childhood, or also to some degree. But you also have a much higher incidence of physical illnesses like diabetes, like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, symptoms, physical illnesses, and pulmonary disease. I mean, it's really, when people talk about, and you're pretty fortunate, I would say, in UK, because you do have the NHS, which it's not a perfect system, but it really is quite an equitable system. So it behooves the insurers, and in this case, the government, to take a serious look at the effects of trauma on overall health, not just anxiety, depression, suicidality, but again, of all of these so-called organic diseases. I actually was invited many, many years ago, not many, many years, maybe 8-10 years ago at the most. I was invited there to have dinner with Gordon Duncan Smith, if that's his name, and some of his people, and they were interested in whether this kind of trauma-informed area could be helpful to improving healthcare delivery and reducing the level of illness. And unfortunately, I don't think it went anywhere. But again, I think these are important things that we have to consider, as a society, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you should say that you think we're fortunate here. I mean, certainly my experience of the NHS is that it's not particularly trauma aware. We're not in a conversation.
No. I don't know of any that we are.
Actually, it's California. If there's anywhere where that conversation it gets the most airtime and exposure, and that's what I've spent so much time in California working on my own trauma, because there just aren't the same level of resources and expertise here. So I think, so I suppose, but it seems to me that just the West in general, for some, is finding it difficult to integrate all of this research. And the
research now is really, and thankfully, the person who developed the scale, one of the co-developers of the scale, who I know, Vincent Felitti, their work was not used for decades. It just kind of lay fallow. And but now it's starting to show up in different areas. For example, as intake when children are starting elementary school. So the teachers know a little bit about who are the kids who are going to be in struggle, who need extra attention because of their trauma histories. So it's beginning to seep into different institutions. And again, it's a very simple test. You do it in a minute or two, a couple of minutes. And it's quite revealing.
And why do you think people find it so difficult to take on these ideas?
Well, I think we're all afraid of trauma. We're all afraid of, if we acknowledge trauma in others, then we're going to be acknowledging it also in ourselves. And without tools, trauma rules. But with the right tools, we can touch to our traumas, we can meet to our traumas, and we can transform them. Literally transform them, changing the molecular memory of them through body awareness, through contacting the living, sensing, knowing body that exists in all of us.
Yeah. And here's maybe a somewhat trivial example, but I spent 10 years doing yoga and I could never get close to touching my toes, right? Mm-hmm. In the last 3 years, I've been doing rolfing and working deeply into the fascia around the top, around my hamstrings and into my psoas. And in fact, this morning I did a very powerful rolfing session, and I can now not just touch my toes, I can pretty much get my palms on the floor. And I know that sounds trivial, but it's just in terms of transformation, that was completely beyond anything that would have been possible in my lifetime before I started Rolfing. And the combination of the Rolfing and the primal work I've been doing has been utterly transformative.
I think it's very, very important, very useful, very important to do some kind of body work like you did at the right time. I don't think it would have been helpful for starting with that. But I think it's very important. I trained with Ida Rolf in 1969 and 1970, and I greatly honor her and appreciate her from what I learned from her. So yeah, that's a way really, because the trauma gets stored not just in the nervous system, not just in the muscles, but also in the connective tissue itself. And Rolfing is one of the most powerful ways of getting to that, getting at that.
Yeah. So what's your focus now? Yeah. I know we've just had the last book, but it'd be interesting.
Yeah. Well, I'm working on a couple of other books, one on healthy adolescent sexuality, and the other on shame and dignity, shame, pride, and dignity. But I'm working on a project which is really probably the biggest project that I've ever worked on, well, except for getting the Institute together. And over the decades, I've probably worked with hundreds of people who have symptoms like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, irritable bowel, migraines, urinary problems, and so forth. And people with those kind of conditions do have a higher degree of trauma histories. But anyhow, in the U.S. alone, there's at least 20 million people suffering from some of those conditions. I'd say it's more than that. And worldwide, in Western countries, it's, it'd be all of them individually. The majority of them have been able to eliminate those symptoms or reduce those symptoms dramatically so that they could function back in life. But if there are tens of millions of people, and we've trained maybe now 30,000 practitioners worldwide, there's no way that they're going to be able to reach those people in need. So I'm working on an online program to help people with those kind of symptoms reduce or even eliminate those symptoms through different guided exercises, guided awareness exercises.
Right. And I can imagine an immediate pushback there. People, isn't that dangerous? People going in by themselves into this territory.
Well, this is something that's been on the top of my mind in developing the program. So we have a lot of built-in safety mechanisms, including the ability to be in a weekly group with a person that I've trained, or if they need to be able to see someone individually through something like a Skype call, or get information about therapists in their area. The program does not focus on trauma, but we do have a part that's really devoted to the fact that when you reconnect with your body, that it's very possible that it'll also bring up access to different kind of procedural memories, emotional memories. So we have ways to help people deal with that. That's not the primary focus, but that is an element of it. And we've had many, many discussions of how to put this into the system and how to make sure that the interaction between the computer or the phone and the person is the right kind of interface. So we've hired a person who's one of the world's experts, really, on human-computer interaction. So I know that we can't be 100%, but we want to get very close to that, and know that we can help the great majority of people with these kind of conditions. So it's a very big project, really, really big project. It's taken thousands of hours already. But we hope to launch the first one in January or February for a small group of people to test out the basic program.
And this is aimed more at, so this is less about recovery and more about building awareness. Am I right? It's
based again on body awareness. And what happens is when people get locked into a condition like fibromyalgia, all they're aware of is the pain, and they're not aware of the peripheral sensation. And as they become more aware of the peripheral sensations, often positive sensations, then the pain starts to dissipate. Because what happens when you have chronic pain is people tend to hyper-focus on the pain. And that it kind of keeps the pain reactivated. So by having, again, new experiencing, the areas of the brain that involve pain are also areas of the brain that process emotional information. So when we're able to restore those parts of the brain, the function of those parts of the brain to where they belong, then the pain signal disappears or becomes less and less, sometimes disappears, and then hence the symptoms disappear. So again, it's built on neuroscience. It's built on my 45 years of experience of developing somatic experiencing and teaching it over the world. So anyhow, we'll be seeing what goes on pretty soon, but I'm going to have to leave right now.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. We'll put some links to the Institute and to the books.
Come on in.
The notes. And I know we've got over your 40 minutes, but I am extremely grateful for the conversation.
Oh, yeah, gladly. And the website is traumahealing.org.
Traumahealing.org.
We have trainings all over the world. There are definitely trainings in the UK and people who are trained as therapists in the UK.
Okay. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.